Once again, good afternoon, everyone. This is Dexter F. Tinampay for reporter for this afternoon. So, today's session, I am going to discuss all about the Victorian Age in English literature in 1837 to 1901. Victorian era in British history, the period between approximately 1820 and 1914, corresponding roughly but not exactly to the period of Queen Victoria's reign in 1834 to 1901, and characterized by a class-based society, a growing number of people able to vote, a growing state and economy, and Britain's status as the most. Next is period introduction overview. During the Victorian Age, England changed as much as dramatically as it had in all of its previous history. Between 1837, when Victoria ascended the throne, and 1902 when she died, the population of London grew up from about 2 millions to well over 6 million and parallel population boom. And also changes in industrial production techniques had a profound impact on almost all aspects of life for every class of citizen. Unregulated industrialization created great prosperity for a lucky few, but great misery for the masses. Victorian era writers were mixed in their reaction to industrializations, and some celebrated the new age of promise, progress, and triumph, while others challenged the so called benefits of industrial growth when so many were being affected so negatively. Next is Queen Victoria and Victorian temper. In many ways, the Victorian age reflected values that Queen Victoria herself espoused: moral responsibility and domestic property. For us proper, an age as the Victorian period seemed, however, there was as much evidence of social dissolution and moral impropriety. So Queen Victoria, perhaps more so than any previous monarch, became visually synonymous with the country she ruled, in part because she was the first monarch who lived in the age of photography, and their image could be relatively easily produced, reproduced, and distributed. And next, writers of the Victorian period tended to note more explicitly than has writers of previous ages the degree to which there was, for good or ill, an era of rapid transition and change. Thus, scholar often refers to three distinct phases within the Victorian period, and those are the early, the mid, and late. But early, it was published. It was 1830 to 1848, while mid is 1848 to 1817, and late also 1870 to 1901. So, because the Victorian period lasted so long and because it was a time of such great change, it is hard to characterize in any singular overarching way. And also, we often also recognize the final decade of the 19th century as an important transitional period between the Victorian era and modernism. So first that we are going to discuss is all about the early period in 1832, 1830 rather, to 1848, which is a time of troubles. The early Victorian period is marked by two major non-literary events. So first is the public railways expanded on an unprecedented scale. Second is the British Parliament passed a reform bill in 1832 that redistributed voting rights to reflect growing population in newly industrializing centers like Manchester and Liverpool. And 1832 Reform Bill marked for many Victorians the beginning of a new age of political power unlike they had ever experienced. The 1830s and 1840s became known as a time of troubles because industrialization was producing such rapid change on such a profound scale. Industrialization had a cascading effect rather, in as much as of caused any other social troubles. Working conditions were deplorable for the majority of for the people, including women and children who work on mines and factories. As group called the Cartists organized themselves to fight for workers' rights. The organization fell apart by 1848, but their efforts set the stage for real and meaningful reform. One of the most important reforms of the early Victorian period came with the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. So these laws imposed high tariffs on imported wheat and grains, and then while the tariff meant good profits rather for England's own agricultural produces, it also meant prohibitively high prices, especially on basic food items for the vast majority of the population. The literature of this time period of then focused on the plight of the poor and the new urban reality of industrial England. Many writers commented on what had emerged as two Englands, that of the wealthy or by far the minority, and that of the poor by far the minority. So we are done about the early Victorian period. So this time, let's proceed about the mid-Victorian period in 1848 to 1870, which is economic prosperity, the growth of empire and religious controversy. The mid-Victorian period or era was somewhat less tumultuous than was the early Victorian period as the relationship between industry and government began to work itself out. However, the time was still one of great poverty and difficulty for many, even as England as a whole began to enjoy greater prosperity. A number of acts of parliaments curbed the worst abuses the laissez-faire industry, like child labor and dangerous working conditions. The Crystal Palace was designed using modern architectural principles and materials, and its role in the Great Exhibition was to showcase English progress made possible by science and industry. The mid-Victorian period was also time when the British Empire truly expanded around the globe, which is the Australia and Canada and also the India. All part and parcel of the prosperity made possible by the Industrial Revolution. In England itself, debates about religion grow intensity. By the mid-Victorian period, the Church of England had evolved into three factions, which is a low or evangelical church, a broad church, and a high church. Each had their share of proponents and detractors. As primary driver behind the Industrial Revolution, rationalists thought they established religious belief. Groups like utilitarian or Vitamins came to see traditional religion as little more than outmoded superstition. New discoveries in the science also led to a new mode of reading the Bible. Higher criticism approached the Bible not as divine and invaluable text, but rather as an historically produced set of documents that reflected the prejudices and limitation of their human writers. Among other scientific works of the time, Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species in 1859 and The Descent of Man in 1871. seemed to challenge all the previous thinking about creation and man's specially role in the world. So as popular readers understood Darwin or Charles Darwin, man was just one among many creatures who existed as a product of a long evolutionary history. The mid-Victorian period would ultimately see often contrary forces like the promise of progress, yet the emptiness of long-held beliefs that would come to a head during the final decades of the Victorian era and that would eventually be its undoing. So we are done about the mid period of Victorian age. So this time, let's proceed for the late period in 1870 to 1901, which is the decay of Victorian values. For many, the late Victorian period was merely an extension, at least on the surface, of the affluence of the preceding years. For many others, though, the late Victorian period became a time to fundamentally question and challenge the assumptions and practices that had made such affluence possible. So it became a time to hold England to account for the way in which it had generated wealth for so few on the back so many, both at home and throughout the empire. So home rule for Ireland became an increasingly controversial topic of debate. In 1867, a second reform bill passed, extending voting rights even further to some worker class citizens. So the political writings of authors like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels empowered the working class to imagine itself in control of the industry that it made possible. So the 90s, gone was trust in Victorian propriety and morality. Instead, many writers track a fantasy or fantastical, which means the end of the century, oppose a weary sophistication with the optimism of forward progress when the limits of that progress seem all too near in sight. So with benefit of hindsight, we can see the 1890s as a transitional phase between the optimism and promise of the Victorian period and the modernist movement. So in which artists began to challenge just how genuine that optimism and promise had been in the first place. So the final decade of the Victorian period marked a high point both of English industry and imperial control, and of challenges that industry and imperialism. So even while British Empire building continued with great energy in Africa and India, in England, many were starting to see the beginning of the end of the era. So we are done the 90s, then this time the role of women as well. So despite the fact that the reform bills of 1832 and 1867 changed voting rights by granting and political voice to many among the worker class who had not enjoyed any such voice before, women were not included in these reforms. So in fact, despite its having been an era of great social change, the Victorian period saw little progress for women's rights. Women had limited access to education, could not vote or hold public office, and could not own the property. So 1848, the first women college was established, which is women were otherwise excluded from England's three universities. So related to the largest women question, the problem of prostitution gained increasingly visibility. Prostitution itself grew, in part to fill demand of course, but also because or was actually a better choice for many women relative to the working condition they would face in the factories. Literacy, publication, and reading. So as of 1837, roughly half of England's population was literate. That figure continued to grow throughout the Victorian period, which is due especially to reform that mandated at least minimal education for everybody. So the Victorian period saw enormous growth in periodicals of all kinds. Many famous novelists like Charles Dickens, for example, installment in magazine. The practical reality of publishing in serial form had this impact on style. As literacy proliferated, the reading public became more and more fragmented. Writers thus has to consider how their writing might appeal to niche audience rather than to a unified reading public. So in other words, while women argued for access to employment and beyond, the stereotypical fact of the middle class wife who had to while away her time at home with insignificant trivial points, hundreds of thousands of lower class women in grueling industrial condition in mines and mills. And also, the most importantly, debates about gender did not necessarily fold the gender lines. Many men argued adamantly for women's rights, and many women, just like Queen Victoria, were not convinced the women should enjoy equality with men. Short fiction and the novel. Short fiction thrived during the Victorian period thanks in part of the robust political culture of the time. The novel was perhaps the most prevalent genre of the time period. It was especially well suited to authors who wanted to capture the wide diversity of industrial life and the class conflict and division that industrialism created. So a common theme among Victorian novelists involves a protagonist who is trying to define him or herself if relative to class and social systems. Then the poetry as well. While prose fiction was the most widely circulated kind of writing in the Victorian period, so poetry retained its iconic status as high literature. As some Victorians would argue, it was through the writing and study of poetry in particular that individuals could cultivate their greatest human potentials. So most readers continue to expect poetry to teach a moral lessons even though many writers were uncomfortable with that aim. Next is prose. Non-fiction prose writing gained wide readerships during the Victorian period, or due again to the vibrant political culture. No less, authors were attracted to non-fiction prose as the best vehicle for addressing in a direct and specific way the problems of industrial England and in some cases for proposing solutions to these problems. So much Victorian nonfiction prose is marked by a sense of urgency, which reflects the pace of change of the age. Many authors felt that society would, at some point, be overwhelmed by change and descended into some form of what Matthew Arnold called simply anarchy. So nonfiction prose authors convey that we must tackle the suspense that were as diverse as the age itself, including politics, religious, art, economic, and the education as well. So the last is that the drama and theater. The Victorian theater was a popular institution, especially for those with the means to enjoy it as one of life's many pleasures. Especially towards the end of the Victorian period, playwrights like George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde began to reflect in an increasingly satirical way the pretentious values and behavior that they believe characterized Victorian's life. In addition, the tradition plays, the theater and drama also included all manners of spectacle, from burlesque and musicals and to pantomime as well. So this is my reference that I'm gathered from the internet, and so I hope that my lessons today, I hope you can gain more knowledge and you can learn something new about my discussion. And I hope if you have some clarifications or violence reactions, you can ask me anytime. And I think that would be all. Thank you for your time, and God bless us all and enjoy your day.